Okay, I think we're going to start. Thanks ever so much for coming to this first annual Woodgate Lecture on Interdisciplinarity. This lecture is funded through Graham Woodgate's legacy, and my colleagues will talk a little bit about him because I didn't actually know him. So I am Wendy Sinschouten, I'm a professor of psychology and the head of the Arts and Sciences department. So when we first started to prepare the Woodgate Lecture, I was sort of I heard so many stories about Graham Woodgate, so I was reading up on him and I came across the Spotlight. Now, I don't know if you know Spotlight. Spotlight is what UCL does to sort of put the spotlight on people who work here. So when I was reading about Graham Woodgate, I read that he liked Queen. I'm just sort of looking at sort of similarities. I love Queen, the band Queen, by the way, not Queen Camilla. But the other thing I read about him, and that's I thought was really lovely, so I'm going to read this out to you. Your duty, this is what he would have said to his younger self. Your duty is to be happy and to spread that happiness to those around you. And I thought that was just really amazing. So today we're going to do a lecture around interdisciplinarity. But before we do so, I would like to hand over to my colleagues to say a little bit about Graham Woodgate.
Thanks so much, Wendy. Hello, everybody. I'm Thomas Calder. I'm one of the associate professor now, was one of the lecturers in creative health, and Graham was there from day one. Do you want to also just quickly introduce yourself? Is that easier to do it now?
I'm Claire. I'm a lecturer in Arts and Sciences, and I'm head of the BAS degree now.
I'm Sarah Wingate-Gray, also teach on the Arts and Sciences degree.
Well, thank you again, everybody, for coming. And both the number of people here this afternoon and also the spread of people, that many of whom we haven't seen in quite a number of years, who used to work with Graham or used to be part of the department. And as well, lots of new people that mightn't have met Graham or only briefly. I think that combination, that serves as a really strong testament for the deep felt respect and admiration that Graham inspired. And also the ongoing relevance of his life's work, in particular in environmental sociology and agroecology. And I think the lecture that we have following this goes very nicely with that kind of showcasing Graham's leadership in those fields. And he was a true pioneer, I think both in the academic sense, but also in life. Having helped to establish not only this department and another department at UCL, which Claire I think will mention, but also the field of environmental of environmental sociology and agroecology, and having inspired countless of students in both of those departments over the best part of a decade, and many of his colleagues with his undying passion for environmental topics, obviously not least in this uncertain time that we live in, environmentally, climate-related changes. So his passion was always there as a guiding light for so many students seeking to find answers, and many of them are in arts and sciences, seeking to find answers for these intractable problems like environmental change, climate change. And Graham always had an open door for them. And those of us who had the privilege of working alongside him, of knowing him personally, we really miss his smile, his killer smile, and his friendliness, but also his wisdom and leadership. And I feel really grateful to have had the chance of working with Graham. His wit, I should also say, his very dry wit, that was really, great to have part of any conversation. But I think his passion for the environment was really what came first, and shaped every part of his life. From his early career as a forester, working in Oregon, I think, and also in Latin America, then combined with his PhD in political ecology from the University of London, And that allowed him to develop a really profound understanding from a very practical sense of being in woodland and chopping down trees and processing trees to the intricacies of the political implications of working with the environment. So that really helped him to develop this really intricate understanding and also this lifelong commitment to, in particular, to indigenous communities in the global south, not least, obviously, in Latin America, and social justice for these communities. Beyond academia, Graham had a really interesting life as well. And he was managing a small farm. He was managing a small woodland holding. And continuously, when we talked about our weekends, right, and what we might have been up to, he always trumped that, right? He comes into a staff meeting, maybe an exam board, and says, "I'm really grumpy today because I was up since 3 a.m. helping with the lambing." Right? What do you say to that? So I think that was really important, but also, especially during COVID, when we were all locked away and in our individual spaces, Graham was really instrumental for me as well. People like myself who were much less green-fingered than him in providing really helpful gardening advice. And gardening was one of the things, even if it's just pot plants, right, that kept us going during the lockdowns. But also in those endless Zoom conversations that we had after the first lockdown, trying to figure out how we're gonna keep teaching, how we're gonna keep the show on the road, having these informal conversations about how to grow things and how to make things bloom around you, and Graham's wonderful pictures of the bluebells in his forest, and really kept us going and kept us inspired as a team. And I think that was really an amazing contribution that he made. I think I'll shut up now and leave it clear to you.
Yes, I just want to reflect that he was such a very human person, and it was a real privilege to know him. And just briefly talk about his academic career for a moment. So his academic journey, first of all, took him to the Institute of Latin American Studies, where he began as an associate fellow in 2002, later on becoming a post holder from 2004 onwards. And then in 2012, he'd moved to UCL as a founder member of, the Institute of American Studies. And throughout his career, his work reflected his fascination with all things and the complex relationship between nature and society. And so it was no surprise in 2012 when the Arts and Sciences degree, the BAS degree, was launched here at UCL, that Graham joined as a natural and essential founder of that department, founder member of that department, other members who are here today. He had a profound contribution to the Arts and Sciences degree. For over 8.5 years until his retirement, he developed and taught interdisciplinary modules across environmental sociology, but he was also deeply engaged with learning and teaching throughout the degree, and a real inspiration for many of us who taught on the degree. His influence over the ethos and success of the Arts and Sciences degree is very difficult to overstate, and you certainly can't do it in 5 minutes today. But having served as department tutor, he then moved on to become program director, providing us with steady leadership between the departure of Carl Gombrich and the arrival of Tim Jordan, who is over there. And all the time still continuing his passionate teaching. He was a really passionate teacher, and he was deeply interested by students and really helped supporting their academic journeys. And I think many of those who were taught by him can speak testament to that experience. One of the things he did as head of what was then the programme, is oversee the approval process behind the Master of Arts and Sciences, the MASC, in creative health, which really ushered in a new era for us, taking us from an undergraduate programme to a fully fledged academic department. And as Thomas has just mentioned, we should really emphasise that a lot of his headship time was during the time of the COVID pandemic. There were frequent lockdowns, which we all have tried to blot from our memories. and a very rapid requirement for us all to transition to online teaching at very, very little notice for all of those that remember those times with a little bit of horror. So for his relatively short time as head of department was an extremely challenging time for us all, and he managed that with great aplomb, and is a real testament to his humanity and character as a person. Sarah.
Just to end up really and say, this is a selfie with me and Graham. I've out of modesty moved myself out of that shot, but it was kind of, I just was going through my phone and thought, actually, this is the kind of classic Graham smile, and the kind of, we were meeting a colleague from Latin America who'd come over to kind of talk to us about arts and sciences, who we've cropped out the picture as well. But it was that kind of friendliness and that kind of openness and welcoming and warmth that I think is kind of probably the students here I can see who are from Graham's time will, I'm sure, absolutely remember that as being a very, important aspect of him. And obviously his impact went, far beyond formal roles, as Claire and Thomas have already alluded to. He was a brilliant colleague. He was always championing the interests of students in particular, and encouraging them to find their best paths. His openness and care and engagement was really woven into the fabric of the arts and sciences degree. And he was an extraordinarily generous person, both with his time and his spirit. Our Dean of Arts and Humanities here, Stella Brutzes, shared how upon learning that the heads of department received an additional allowance, Graham immediately suggested that it be used, his allowance be used to support students instead, and refused to accept it. So I think that care and selflessness were keenly felt by his students, and who remember him, and just some quotes I grabbed online from various people who called him a passionate educator, a wonderful teacher, and an inspiring guide. So Graham's legacy continues through the generosity he extended beyond his lifetime, a bequest to support students and the establishment of this lecture, and also the Graham Woodgate Dissertation Prize, which is going to be awarded for the first time this year to our arts and science students. So today's lecture not only honours Graham's scholarly contributions, but the vital components, I think, that we feel make up the Arts and Sciences department. So those of compassion, curiosity, and community that he embodied so fully and so well to us. And we welcome you to this inaugural memorial lecture with hopefully the warmth that Graham's smile will always bring. So thank you very much.
So as you can hear, quite a legacy. So I made a few notes. So warm, caring, engaging, generous, and somebody who had a great passion for nature. And we will get to that in a minute. But just to go back. So this is us. The Arts and Sciences Department started as the basket course. Graham became head of department during the pandemic, a really difficult time, and we officially became a department in 2022. So we're all very new, and a lot of us are here, and it's really, really lovely to see all of you here. So we're now moving on to our lecture, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Tim Forsyth. He's Professor of Environment and Development, Head of International Development at the LSE, and he is going to be talking about getting transformative change right for biodiversity and climate change policy.
Thank you.
Okay.
Right, well, thank you very much, everybody. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is basically what Graham talks about in his own work. Which is basically, how do you put environmental sociology into action in the real world? And the real world also implies international development, different places, different values. And what I'm talking about today, which I will explain more of, is this challenge that we have of what we are now calling transformative change. Transformative change is the buzzword, which means what changes in our life and economy do we need now in order to hit the environmental targets that we want to hit. It could be climate change, it could be biodiversity, it could also be the social development goals as well. What do we do now to change society in order to achieve these things? This is a huge area for environmental sociology, as well as other disciplines. And I was involved in an international assessment from an organization a bit like the IPCC for climate change, but this one is for biodiversity, which I will explain in a minute. to try and do this. And it was essentially an exercise in interdisciplinarity. But what actually happened was something else. And that's the purpose of what I'm going to talk about today. So the key themes going on in what I'm going to talk about today are how do you govern values within environmental science. So the idea is values are things which are political, where you make a choice. Science is supposed to be the hard guiding rules which make you guide you whilst you're making this sort of decisions. The obvious point is that for social scientists, or at least for deeper social scientists, these things are never quite separate categories. They get mixed up. Science contains values, values contain science, and so on. So the key themes I'm trying to talk about are what increasingly people are talking about as solutions-oriented analysis. In other words, how can we do science in order to provide solutions for people's problems, which is basically the application of values into policy. I will use the example of transformative change, and I will also talk about the lessons for interdisciplinary work. And by transformative change, I mean the social economic development for environmental objectives, which we will be hearing more and more about over the next 10 years or so. Now, the background to this is this movement towards solution-oriented environmental analysis or assessment. This is a paper I did a couple of years ago with my friends Sylvia Beck and Martin Mahoney, which is basically to say that there is this transition happening in how we do environmental science. The idea is that 20 years ago, the IPCC and other people like that would talk about environmental assessment to ask questions like, is the world getting warmer? Are atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases increasing, and so on, right? To which people call that a global environmental assessment. Now, a solutions-oriented assessment is something that says, well, what do we do about it? In other words, you're not just assessing a supposedly dispassionate, objective idea of is something happening or isn't it, but you actually get involved with values. Now, the challenge we have here is that I'll give you an example. The solution-oriented environmental assessment is essentially what transformative change is all about. It basically doesn't say, are we losing biodiversity? What we're actually doing is saying, given that we're losing biodiversity, how do we change societies in order to achieve this? So the point there is that it's more to do with values. You have to engage with stakeholders to get those values. And you also have to deal with interdisciplinary issues in order to identify what the problem is or what sort of outcomes you want. This is one of the key problems. This is what I think, by the way, is the essence of a disagreement between people like Tony Blair this week and people like Nicola Stern, the economist who does climate change at the LSE. Whereas I think Blair was basically saying that net zero isn't all that, because even if you do achieve net zero, you still have a whole bunch of problems to solve. Whereas Stern was basically saying, yeah, but it's all about net zero. It's all about the gases. Bring the gases into balance, everything's fixed. You know, I think that's the sort of issue that we're talking about. Now, the point I'm trying to drive at here is that IPBES, which is the organization I will talk about, which is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, I'll define that in a minute, created their global environmental assessment in 2019 to basically say that evidence shows that biodiversity is decreasing. They then followed it up with the transformative change assessment in the last couple of years to basically say, what do we do about it? A shift from the GEA to the solution-oriented assessment. But the challenge we have is that there are all sorts of tensions between these things, which is, what are the values when you define a problem? Whose values are you reflecting when you see a problem? How do you engage with stakeholders? What problems of science do you get if you start dealing with values and consultation with stakeholders? Because the IPCC in particular, in the world of climate change, has been affected by the idea that it's all political. And therefore they want to demonstrate that it's not just politics, it's science as well. But the trouble is that the more you do solution-oriented stuff, the more you have to blur the boundary between science and politics. And so therefore, how do you actually come up with hard solutions to where we go? So I'm going to ask these questions. Let's put them here, which is basically in today's talk, talking about the IPBES transformative change assessment, which is how has the transition to solutions-oriented assessments been carried out? How have they defined problems and solutions? How do they define stakeholders and what sort of participation? And how do they deal with the tension between values and desired outcomes? How do they deal with that? And what's going on in the background here is something that people have been talking about for years, which is the problem of universal assumptions about risk, problems and solutions when we talk about climate change and biodiversity and probably most other things, which is essentially, for example, the climate change, that climate change is all about the gases, right? Now, for years, that's how climate change has been defined. More gases equals more problems. I don't think there's any doubt the gases are increasing. But where there is a huge amount of uncertainty is a relationship between the gases and how people experience those gases as problems on the ground. We know, for example, that they cause more storms and floods and droughts and things like that. Yes, sure, but those aren't necessarily universal definitions of problems. Some people experience floods differently from others, okay? It depends on your adaptive capacity. It depends on your social vulnerability to those problems. The two things have to be taken side by side. Now, what's the work of Mike Hulme in particular from Cambridge, a geographer in Cambridge, has talked about climatism as the key problem in climate change policy. The idea that if we fix the gases, then everybody universally benefits. But actually, there's a huge amount of research and analysis that says just fixing the gases can sometimes create more problems for people. For example, if you cover agricultural land with trees, sucking up carbon from other places, you're not actually helping the people who live in that area, at least the people who don't own the trees or don't, get the financial benefits from them. So this is the sort of idea that we want to get beyond a global universal solution. It's the same with biodiversity, which is this idea about values about nature, which have been affecting how do we deal with biodiversity for a long time. So many people are, I think quite rightly, worried about the loss of green wilderness or exotic species, things like that. Of course, we should be worried about that. But there's also a huge backlash against this, which I'm summarizing here from the work of Harold Brookfield under the label of agro-diversity, which basically says that if you get the agriculture right, then you can still have a huge amount of biodiversity, but it's not the same sort of biodiversity as we associate with wilderness. You don't get many tigers, for example, in a rice field, but if you get the right kind of rice field, you can get a huge amount of biodiversity. So this idea of imposing wilderness is something that's been talked about by people like Graham and others, Rob Newman and others, as this idea in political ecology, which is that that much environmental policy is based upon the idea of certain people in certain places thinking what would be a good solution for people over there and giving it to them without actually thinking about what that means to those people there. Now, out of this comes this problem of co-production, which I shall return to. But co-production is another buzzword of the moment, which basically means that we have to deal with problems of values by being in touch with the people we talk to and deal with. In other words, if we consult with people, we can avoid many of these problems, right? Now, what I'm going to be talking about today is that there is a debate about how to interpret co-production between the environmental policy people who basically say, when you're trying to fight climate change, you should talk to the people that you're talking to, versus the deeper sociologists who say things like co-production is a much deeper and unseen connection between facts and norms. In other words, wherever we go, we reproduce values in ways that we don't see, and that also reproduces ideas about who is the person we should be talking to, what problems we should be talking to them about, and so on and so on. But it's very difficult to deal with because it's largely inevitable. Now, this is where I'm largely going to be coming down to later on today in talking about this stuff. Now, I want to mention one person before I talk more specifically about Graham, which is this example here of the past. So in 2005, the world engaged in this thing called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which is a hugely expensive, comprehensive study of how to understand biodiversity change, which set the tone for a few years until IPBES came along and did its global assessment in 2019. This guy from Australia, he's actually a Brit, but he's working in Australia, was an anthropologist brought into the system, and he found it an appalling experience on the grounds that basically he was surrounded in the room by people who are like physicists and biologists, all of whom are excellent scientists, but couldn't quite get the connection with values or with development. And what he claimed in this paper is that you get these cabals, these little cliques of scientists talking amongst themselves and saying things like, well, you know, if the climate changes by X, we're going to lose Y amount of biodiversity. And hey, let's ask Colin, the anthropologist, what he thinks. And he would say something about meanings and values and what an anthropologist would say. And they would all laugh at him and say, oh, well done, Colin. We can always expect you to raise a laugh, right? And he got so pissed off about it that he ended up writing a paper saying, I'm fed up of these assessments masquerading as universal truth, but that what's actually going on is a reproduction of a certain way of viewing things which alienates others. Now, I'm flying that at the moment because it reminds me of my own experience with the IPBES transformative change assessment. So I'm going to talk about this guy. So I had the good fortune of meeting Graham, I think in 1996. We were both much younger. And I was very much a junior academic. And I had got myself onto the position of being the representative on the environmental research group of the Geography Network of Science. We had a meeting in Y College in Kent, and I wouldn't go to Y College today. It's too much of a journey just to go for a short meeting, but nonetheless I did. And there I met Graham, and we had a long talk. And the thing about the late 90s was that all these ideas about social theory were just emerging. And one of the books that people talked about was this one, which I think for many years has been a high point of how to do good social theory and environmental sociology about global environments, edited by Michael Redcliffe and Ted Benton, right? And this was a book which is kind of hard to read, for me anyway. And I was talking to Graham about it. And then to my great surprise, Graham announced, I hadn't realized this, but he was actually a co-author of one of the key chapters. And that immediately got us talking about what was in this chapter. And in particular, there was one diagram that I wanted to talk to him about, which is this one. This is not Graham's diagram, but it was in his chapter. And this is a famous diagram by a historian of environmentalism in the United States called Fraser Roderick Nash. And I talked to him about this. I'll explain this in a minute, right? And Graham actually expressed disappointment about this diagram because the publishers had mixed up these labels here. They should be the other way around. Now, in preparing for this lecture, I actually went to the library to check, and it seems that the latest editions of this book still have that error in it. But let me put it into this sort of diagram here, which is easier to see. Now, the point about Nash, this Nash diagram, is, well, from a very simple level, this is a sociologist pretending to be an economist. Okay, he's basically making a point about perception, but he's using language like marginal value of nature. And it's a very simple argument, but it's a kind of seductive argument, which is that the more developed you get, the more you perceive nature as something to value, right? But the inverse works as well, which is that the less developed you are, the more you care about modernity as opposed to civilization, as opposed to nature. And obviously the key point here is that what we call nature will vary a great deal. The idea is that if you're up at this level here, high level of development of civilization, modernity, let's say midtown Manhattan, then you're so fed up of the noise and the pollution and the costs and the hassle that you quite fancy spending some time among some trees or whatever, right? You know, you want to get out. Meanwhile, if you're living in very poor accommodation in the middle of Africa, for example, then you could do with some air conditioning and some piped water, and you've had enough of the trees and the rats and the snakes. You know, maybe it's the inverse is happening. Now, the interesting point is that if these people are more developed and they're more in charge of the environmental agenda for policy, then what does that do to people down here? I mean, the classic debate of the last 20 years is that all these people living in Midtown Manhattan might want to go on holiday to, I don't know, Costa Rica to experience that nature. And they then might want to offset their emissions in flying to Costa Rica by putting money into a fund that plants trees somewhere else in order to suck up all those carbon emissions. And the point here is that really what these people down here want? Why aren't these people getting something a little bit more relevant to what they would like to have? So just to illustrate this a bit further, here are some photographs of images which might emerge at certain times. So in particular, this area here, this sort of transition when nature begins to be seen, could look a bit like this. This is a wonderful portrait landscape in the United States, in the Yosemite Valley, painted around about 1868. Now, I know that the first national park in the United States was, 1872, Yellowstone. After the Civil War, it's like, you know, the industrialization, urbanization was happening. And then they started exploring the West, and this became a sort of a certain model. You could say that in Britain, for example, the writings of William Wordsworth in the 1820s was the poems was all to do with the Lake District. It's like the birth of the perception of nature. Now, this might compare with people at the top end of the scale here, which might be this sort of thing. So this mural from the side of a supermarket in Palo Alto, for me, represents the top end, because this representation of the mature health professional looking after the injured polar bear, I think, is a wonderful metaphor for climate change responsibility. Okay, but at the same time, this is focused upon the charismatic megafauna. If you went to India and talked about climate change, usually they don't talk about polar bears. They'll talk about justice and energy and water and, you know, clean development rather than furry animals as such. In fact, it's interesting. It's something I talk about as the polar bearization of climate policy, that if you go around and look at things, how far people show images of polar bears in order to signify the idea of crisis. Not that there isn't a crisis, but it's a representation. Now, the other way of looking at this is the bottom end down here, which I would suggest is this. Now, this is a mural from somewhere else in California. And for me, that's an environmental picture, but it's much more to do with poverty and people. So it's environmental because you've got all this, okay? You've got the congested housing, you've got people living with it. But there's also much more people-oriented. There's not really this idea of nature as this threatened wilderness. It's much more to do with living standards, health. There's also probably a gendered element to this as well. So the idea is that this is much more of a, I would say, the less developed vision of environment. It's less to do with nature as lost wilderness. It's more to do with living in good quality. The trouble is that the sort of higher levels of defining nature still persist in various ways. So just to show some pictures from London, like this. This is Pret-a-Manger. Do I have to say any more? Grown around vibrant rainforest, served in the concrete jungle. Okay? So this is Fraser Roderick Nash coming home to roost on Kingsway. This one amuses me every time. This is still there today, okay? This is Parkway in Camden Town on the way to Regent's Park. Okay, this is the junction, right? Noise, dirt, graffiti, cars, road, pollution, and the gym, right? When you zoom in on the gym, this is what they have. It's called Sustainable Fitness. Near Wonder Woman running through a rainforest, and we plant a tree for every workout you do. Now, my point is that, of course, forests are lovely. That's why I'm in this game, as indeed was Graham, I think. Of course, we should be worried about forests. Of course, we should be worried about rainforests. Of course, we should encourage the idea of wilderness. However, the question is that how far does that influence how we talk about environmental policy, and what does that mean to representing people at different levels of development? Now, this is partly connected to older debates, which environmental sociologists will know well, which is this idea of nature and modernity, and the idea that in the 1960s, you had critical theorists or Frankfurt School people like Herbert Marcuse writing books like One-Dimensional Man. You also have other people like Habermas writing the same stuff, where you get this idea of the domination of nature is linked to the domination of man, right? And what they meant by that was the idea of the horrors of living under modernity, under instrumental reason, where we all have to go to work and live according to the rational logic of modern society. That's what they meant by nature, human nature. But it's moved very quickly to this idea of green nature. So Al Gore's first book, Earth and the Balance, which, if you read, it's a very romantic, deep green vision of the world. We have become so successful at controlling nature that we have lost our connection to it. That's 1992. Right? Carolyn Merchant, a brilliant scholar from Berkeley, who one of the key thinkers in ecofeminism, talked about the domination of women coming from the same root cause of the domination of nature, which is modernity, etc., right? And all of this, I'm arguing, is an illustration of what Giddens, the sociologist, would say that basically when we talk about nature, what we're talking about is this idea of something separate from modernity and industrial progress, and therefore has a certain social context. Now, my point in saying this is to say, make it absolutely clear, I am not saying we should not do environmental conservation, but I am saying we need to be careful about the values and the perceptions we use when we talk about it. Okay? What baggage do we bring to talking about global nature? Or to put it another way, how do these ideas travel to different places? Which is that when we talk about nature and modernity, and we start applying it to countries which have got high levels of poverty and very little else, what baggage are we doing? Are we restricting them in some ways? And this comes down to the idea of co-production that I talked about, which is that for many environmental scientists, the way to do this is to contact the people in that area whilst you're trying to do a project like plant trees to offset carbon. Whereas a deeper vision, here quoting Sheila Jasanoff, is, for example, the idea that we will always have baggage in what we talk about. And the idea here is we end up mixing what is with what is ought to be. In other words, how we measure the world usually reflects how we would like to live within it. So to give you some examples of how that might work, I took this photograph in Delhi some years ago. And the point, I hope it's pretty clear, which is that you'd have to plant a lot of trees before you get rid of these metal pipes. And if you did plant lots of trees, then you would certainly get rid of that water course because the water would be sucked up by the trees. Now, maybe that's okay. I suspect it isn't, though. I suspect that this water course serves lots of functions like water or fish or some other function which might actually serve the people living here. The point is this sort of naive green is best idea can sometimes look rather odd if you apply it out of context. Or this cartoon from the New Yorker is this idea that somehow if you get the nature right, then you get society right, is missing the point that actually there's probably an under-theorization of how economic growth, modernity, and environmental perception are actually linked, and that what we're actually doing is relying too much upon a rather romantic late modern view of what nature should be when we're talking about other societies. So that seems to be the perfect point to shift to the IPBES transformative change assessment. So I think I've already talked about what the transformative change assessment was. The IPBES was basically set up to be like a biodiversity and ecosystem version of the IPCC. It is a sister organization to the IPCC, but is different from the IPCC. So IPCC was formed in 1990, and it has 3 working groups which really do separate the science from impacts and practices to put mitigation into place. And the usual thing about the science is that that's all about atmospheric modeling, and this is full of like people who do development and economic growth and stuff like that, right? Now, IPBES doesn't have different working groups, but it is undoubtedly dominated by the physical scientists. So it's run by the multidisciplinary expert panel. But when you look at the multidisciplinary expert panel, they're all physical scientists. There are no social scientists. Now, having said that, it's difficult to know what a social scientist is. There's an anthropologist. In the chapter that I worked in, everybody called one person an anthropologist, but she was actually an ethnobotanist. Now, I'm not saying that one is good or bad, but an ethnobotanist is somebody who does botany by talking to local people. Well, that's good stuff, right? But it ain't anthropology, right? Anthropology is something much bigger, right? But those sorts of nuances are not really there. Now, another thing that's going on is that the reports are sequenced. So they did the physical change, or the global environmental assessment in 2019, which is biodiversity decreasing? Yes, it is. And then they did the solutions later, which is a transformative change assessment, which is, okay, given that the biodiversity is declining, what do we do about it? It's also set up by this sort of rules and conventions. So this is their conceptual framework. I'm not going to say anything good or bad about this diagram. Personally speaking, I look at this and I don't think it makes much sense to me, okay? But I'm not going to say that it's rubbish, because lots of really brainy people have worked on this. It's just the way in which different disciplines work on things. But the thing which I notice in all of this is this language here, living in harmony with nature, living well in balance and harmony with Mother Earth, systems of life, and so on. Nature's gifts. All this sort of language is flashing lights to people who've done environmental sociology or cultural studies or anthropology. The point being is that these things are represented. This diagram gives the impression of being a scientific guide to what they're trying to do, but there's actually a load of statements in here which might potentially be a little bit unexplored, at least. Like, what is Mother Earth, for example? And in the 2019 global assessment, they came up with this diagram, which is loved or hated depending on where you come from. This is called the levers and leverage diagram. This is their way of solving the world, okay? And the idea here is that there are interventions here from different people. So they've got these rainbow people, which is meant to mean diversity. Good. I must admit, they're all, I think, men, but that's another story. Anyway, these multicolour rainbow men are pushing on the lever, which will then invoke these leverage points, which could be like reduce inequalities, in order to create these useful outcomes, which could be like, useful outcomes like changes in land use and so on. And there's got this rather odd iterative learning loop, which somehow connects everything, but there's nothing here about what that actually means. Now, this is important because I actually had a conversation with the guy who created this diagram, and I said, I don't think this diagram or the chapter in the global assessment deals with deliberation enough, or deliberative politics. Now, deliberative politics is one way to deal with iteration, okay? But the idea is that people talk amongst themselves. And he got quite angry. He said, of course it is. It's all in there. We don't have to deal with it anymore. It's already covered. So being the nerd that I am, I went back to his chapter. It's 15,000 words. And I looked for words with delib as a start, either deliberative or deliberation. And it popped up 8 times out of the 15,000 words. And there was no section on how to bring different values together. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that to say that, therefore, the global assessment is wrong, but I'm saying that to indicate the engagement with interdisciplinarity. It's this idea that they wrote this report in 2019 to say, this is what we need to do, this is it, these are the leverages, and we're going to have iterative learning loops. But the guy who wrote the diagram really didn't know what he was talking about when it came to deliberative politics. Moreover, he wasn't interested in hearing from me, somebody from a social science institution, to talk to him about what deliberation might mean. Okay? So how does this look in practice? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some those themes. Remember those questions I asked? I'm going to give you some evidence about those themes. I don't want to spend too long on that because I think it could be a bit boring to spend too long looking at quotations. And then I'll get to the point at the end. So first up is this idea of how does it define problems? How does the transformative change assessment? So the transformative change assessment, just to be clear, has just been launched 2 weeks ago. The final version has come out. It's online. People can now read it. And this sort of idea pops up all the way through. The idea of nature dominated by modernity. It comes up at different stages, like this. Disconnection from nature is a key underlying cause of biodiversity loss and nature's decline. Okay, it's this idea, it's repeating the conceptual diagram that nature is something out there we must all love, but there's no theorization about what we mean by nature or who gets to define nature or possible differences in how people talk about nature. So what we end up with are lots of diagrams like this. And again, I don't want to be too dogmatic about this, but this sort of diagram doesn't do much for me, but it might do things for other people. So the point here is what does this actually mean? I think the key point is that this is their idea of progress from relations of domination to relations of care. Now, one interesting thing, I mean, just to show the interdisciplinarity again, we were asked to nominate people to join the group, the chapter group. And I was saying, well, we need some more environmental sociologists. We need more political analysts of environmental policy, you know, this sort of thing. I was outvoted and they chose this wonderful guy from the Netherlands. I won't mention his name because I've got immense respect for him, but I really disagree with what he says. And this guy writes specifically on transformative change rather than on social transformations. And for him, the word he wanted to use was social contract. Okay, what do you mean by social contract? Well, according to him, it's the transition you get from when you have individuals suddenly working with each other. Okay, and that's the transition. And he wanted to write 2,000 words. We had 8,000 words to write. He wanted 2,000 of them to make that one point, which is that progress is individuals working together, right? Now, my point is that this completely overlooks so much to do with institutions theory or structures in society and all this other stuff, right? Anyway, the point is that this is what people who see the world that way tend to generate as a sort of the definition of a problem and the definition of a solution. Let's move on a bit more. How do they define stakeholders and participants? Well, the short answer is that they adopt that shallow approach to co-production, which is that you label the people that you want to get in touch with. So we want to have dominating relations, construct racial, gendered, and anthropocentric hierarchies. People who are included, people who are excluded. So women, indigenous peoples, elderly, people living with disabilities, and racialized peoples. Quoting Merchant and Plumwood, these are eminent, brilliant ecofeminists, but from 40 or 30 odd years ago. Now, my point here is, of course, we want to be inclusive and kind to all of these groups and others, okay? But what they're doing is basically having this very literal approach to saying, oh, you're a person of color, let's include you. You're a woman, let's include you, without thinking deeper about what's actually going on. It's a very essentialist approach. In particular, the thing which upset me, because I worked a lot with indigenous people in Southeast Asia, is that they talked about indigenous knowledge in universal and essentialistic and rather romantic terms. So this sort of quotation, this idea of many indigenous peoples and local communities conceive people as part of nature rather than having dominion over it. Now, the point is, I'm all in favour of empowering indigenous people, but the way in which they tended to talk about this tended to repeat this sort of late modern vision of nature as dominating society, rather than understanding how different perceptions might emerge and how that might reduce how we understand nature or reduce how we understand indigenous people. So one thing I found to be interesting was that the IPBES assessment had a commitment to keep on talking about indigenous people, and they had a technical unit, which is a group of people who were not officially scientists, but whose job it was to carry everybody to make sure that they were ticking the box of indigenous people enough of the time. But when you looked at their documentation, this is a crucial point, which is that they only really want to talk about indigenous people when they are talking about people who are working on the land using traditional land practices. Now, that is true for many people around the world. Many indigenous people do use traditional land practices, and they're happy doing that. However, there is a number of things which are questionable. There are many examples of indigenous people being blamed for those traditional practices because they are alleged to damage biodiversity. But also, there are many indigenous people who don't do traditional land uses, but have actually moved into the city. And their cosmologies might mean a great deal to them, their identity, their beliefs, their religion, but not necessarily their land use, not necessarily their way of planting rice. But also from the point of view, a development point of view, the idea that we should embrace and champion the idea of traditional people using traditional land use is at the very least problematic, because it can mean that you're basically saying to these people, you should stay where you are and you shouldn't change. And many of these people, I'm using very general words here, but things like much traditional agriculture can use unequal gender roles. They can rely upon kids doing the work, which is now no longer feasible, if indeed it is desirable. But also the levels of nutrition and the quality of life of these people isn't great either. So the point is that there's a great deal of debate about this, but the general view was that we needed to be in touch with indigenous people because they know how to use traditional land uses. And some people wanted to present the idea that the answer to achieving transformative change is to empower the indigenous people because these are relics of a pre-Enlightenment age. The idea that everything went wrong with the emergence of Enlightenment and capitalism, we go back to an age before then we'll end up back in balance with nature and everything will be fine. All of this is, of course, at the very least, debatable. I've done some work myself just to show you this in Thailand, where we talk about how different ethnic groups are presented in different ways. So the Hmong people are usually given a bad press, partly because they were always feared to be communist. The Karen people, on the other hand, are always portrayed as close to nature. And my friend Andrew Walker has written about this thing called the Karen consensus, which he basically says that there are the political circumstances in which coalitions can emerge, which create the image of the Karen as useful to different parts of the political debate. The idea here is that the state and the hard, deep green middle-class activists want to have examples of people who can live in forests and look after them, okay? And they choose a Karen as that example, right? And these are also acceptable to the pro-development people who want people to live in the forests. And the Karen, for what it's worth, are always producing images like this in order to say, hey, look at us, we're nature friendly. Look, tree hugging, And the world's divided between those people who love this stuff and say, oh, look, they're close to nature, And those people like me would say, hang on, what's going on here? Now, I don't want to go on too much about this. I'm going to move on a bit more to the next thing, which is that it's also worth noting that anything to do with civil society and community was considered good. This idea that basically, if it isn't business, then it must be good. And if it's civil society, it must be good. The idea of divisions within civil society or conflicting ideas about green wilderness versus local development rights, just ignored totally. And they come up with diagrams like this, which I find hard to believe. This is social movements play a crucial role in challenging drivers of biodiversity loss and fostering transformative change. And they list all these places here of social movements, all of whom are considered to be good. And this gives an indication of which ones have actually had a success and which ones haven't. But there's absolutely no discussion as to, for example, the tensions between different social groups or different people who are part of social movements and so on. So this is the challenge. Now, what I'm trying to get at here is, final question, is how do we deal with different views? They're basically saying what I think we know that they're saying, which is that empower the non-business actors and increase the representation of knowledge systems, but knowledge systems are seen in essentialistic terms between like Western science plus indigenous knowledge at the same time equals a good balance, rather than actually understanding the politics of how this actually happens. So I'm going to come to some conclusion, which is my talk is about interdisciplinarity and solution-oriented assessment. My point here is that obviously the transformative change assessment is designed to be a solution-oriented assessment. It's trying to tell the world about how to do things. It wasn't very successful in my view. It's basically rehearsing this old idea that nature is dominated by modernity, so let's slow down modernity and let's empower the people who are not part of modernity in order to achieve that sort of beneficial outcome. There are all sorts of problems in trying to create alternative viewpoints. One small example, learning, for example. In my chapter, one of the editors wanted me to write on monitoring, evaluation and learning, MEL. And I wrote a section on that. And then he kept on editing it to take out any discussion of learning. Because for him, learning means people being told that there are ecological limits and restricting themselves to live with those limits, rather than the idea of trying to reflect upon knowledge in order to make it better. It's a rather frustrating experience. There was also another initiative from various people to do a broader source of consultation with businesses and civil society people. This was rejected by IPBES for various procedural reasons. So what does this mean about interdisciplinarity? I should probably end on this point, which is that this is an actual quotation from one of the main editors of the whole report, Arun Agrawal, who has worked with Ellen Ostrom and has also written a book about Foucauldian approaches to environment. We were talking about what social science could bring to the assessment. He stood up at the end of this discussion and said, "We are losing biodiversity too fast. We have no time for social science." Now, what's interesting about that is that various people complained about that statement and also about the reality that the assessment wasn't really moving ahead in a social science way. So the editors tried to fix it by suddenly, belatedly, contacting lots of social scientists with this email. Now, I've taken out the names of the people in this email, but this is a genuine email. 14th of March last year, invitation to contribute to the assessment. Dear so-and-so, we would like you to contribute to this. This is the actual terms. I said, given your expertise on ecofeminism and feminist political ecology, we invite you to contribute to the following. Please provide brief, high-quality text, description of your theory and framework, maximum 300 words, a summary of how intentional transformative change occurs, 300 words, right? and then give us 5 references. And the idea here is that they would do this sort of scatter collection and then dump it into the pre-prepared assessment and then sort of sort it. Social science, we've got it sorted. These people are with us, they've given us our names, we cannot be criticised for it. And obviously, this is all a bit disappointing. So to conclude, 3 things, 3 points. What does it mean? Well, to a certain extent, it's not surprising, is it? I mean, basically, this idea of the solutions-oriented assessment, the thing I wrote about was back with Martin Mahoney, is the idea that you're shifting from measuring change to sort of measuring impacts and values. It's not surprising that a big, clunky international organization will be behind the curve on it. Okay? The main problem is that they've ended up with this late modern frame, which is masquerading as sort of a hard science. They take an essential approach to actors and knowledge systems, like indigenous people, rather than looking at the politics of how we understand those things. It is supposedly interdisciplinary because there are biologists and economists and the rest of us all participating. But what you end up with are a certain number of core epistemologies singing through, and anyone who wants to deal with it in a more reflective and relational way isn't really allowed to speak. And therefore, all of this defines what the problems and the solutions are. Okay? Now, why is this? Well, I don't know. I mean, we could talk about this. I mean, one key thing is that IPBES is designed to deliver in a linear way. So the global assessment should then talk about how to put the global assessment into action. There's no sense of reflection. Okay, that's one thing. I have to admit, and I mean this in a friendly way, that probably there are too many middle-aged ecologists who read stuff in the 1990s and haven't read anything since. All these people have read Carolyn Merchant, for example, who was brilliant then, but now seem to be a little bit, essentialist. That sort of thing doesn't quite bite. But also just this generic problem that people don't want to talk about social values and science, okay? What we've ended up with is this alliance between systems thinkers and that type of social science which tries to talk about minorities and specific vulnerable groups without necessarily talking about deeper structures. Now, I want to make it clear, I think there's all sorts of reasons to be worried about those groups. But if all you're doing is talking about women and indigenous people and racial minorities, majorities in certain countries, then it's like dealing with the tip of the iceberg rather than understanding why you're seeing a certain part of the structure. And obviously this is what's missing. The idea of how do we put environmental sociology into place. But I'd like to give the last word to Graham Woodgate, because I think this is essentially what he was saying in this paper, which came after the one I just quoted earlier, which is basically the whole point of this isn't to weaken environmental assessment, but to take environmental sociology more seriously. In other words, that you don't see the biophysical science on one hand and then all the society added onto it, but you look at the two together critically in order to get a more balanced way of moving ahead for everyone. Now, that's what I'm trying to do in my own work and my own experience of talking to Graham. And by the way, he was completely a human person. He was one of the rare people I've known in academia to actually have a very friendly, supportive understanding of people. But I also think that he and I shared that same agenda of trying to put people into the picture in the way which was critical of how we talk about people, but also trying ultimately to be positive about including people who weren't previously included. Okay, I'm going to stop. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. That was an inspiring talk. We left quite a bit of time for questions, so if you're happy to answer.
Sure.
But it's absolutely great to see how you bring all these sort of factors together and interdisciplinarity, not just in language, but also in murals, in pictures, in stories and narratives. And it's a really inspiring talk. And I also like how you talk about co-production and how we need to work with members from various communities. And it's not so much necessarily about empowering, because that's who has the power, of course. If I'm empowering you, then I'm giving you the power that I have. It's also about power that exists and exposing sort of stories that are not listened to. And I felt it was really powerful to see this in the pictures and the material you shared. So as I said, we have got a bit of time for questions. Our reception starts at 6 o'clock. So it's over to you to ask all sorts of questions you want to, or to share memories or whatever. Who would like to start? Yeah?
I think it'd be great. To what extent do you think human nature comes into the balance of power and working towards, if I'm allowed to use the word, solution?
I'm not sure what you mean by human nature.
Maybe like human nature in terms of who humans are and their tendencies, because we all have different driving factors, I guess.
Thank you for that. So the question was, how far does human nature come into the discussion of solution-oriented assessment? Well, I guess it depends what you mean by human nature. I mean the current discussion about solution-oriented assessment is a connection to deliberative politics and participatory politics. The idea that you don't go into a place and say, we know what your problem is, here we can solve it for you, but you actually talk to people to create some kind of solution. Now, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're talking about human nature in the sort of a deeper sort of sense of competitiveness or that sort of thing. So the short answer to your question is that according to current debates about solution-oriented assessment, they don't talk about human nature as such. But I think one could probably get there if this debate goes on and on. Part of the debate, I guess, part of the debate about deliberation is connected to the idea of how do we make institutions. So a lot of the debate about institutions has come from a journey from people like Garrett Hardin, who basically says human nature is only to reproduce and that's the end of it. And then Ostrom comes along and says, oh, no, everyone, is competitive, but we can find solutions to it. To all the anthropologists who say things like, well, actually, what you think they're being competitive about isn't actually what is actually happening. There are other things going on. So I think there is a debate about what actually is human nature, and whether we can talk in essential and permanent terms about human nature in fixed ways. But I would have thought that would still be part of the debate about how to do solution-oriented assessments.
Thank you. Next question. Yeah?
Thank you very much for your lecture. I wanted to ask for a few more thoughts about net zero, the way that has functioned discursively in terms of political conversations. You'll be conscious of its role in far-right politics at the moment as a kind of gathering sort of a sense of some kind of top-down politics perhaps, or as an association with kind of deindustrialization and these kind of different ideas. And on a kind of pro-environmental side, you can sometimes feel it's hard to answer, or the only possible answer is just to completely support the current position of net zero. So I would be interested in hearing your unpacking of the way that is functioning as a kind of policy and as a term in our present in UK.
Yeah, thank you. The short answer is I think you and I would agree on the political dynamite that net zero has become. And I want to reiterate that I think that we need to reduce greenhouse gas concentrations. However, as someone who's spent a lot of time in other parts of the world, I know that naive, simple approaches to fixing the gases can sometimes increase the vulnerability or decrease the rights of people in the locations where those things are held. And I think in this worst case forms, net zero can simply allow a country like Indonesia, for example, to continue to grow dirty industry and to have crazy policies of destroying forest on condition that it fixes other parts of forest and excludes all those local land users at the same time. And I think that a lot of the people in this country who talk about net zero as a necessarily good thing don't tend to talk about the possible misuses that net zero could be put to. Now, where it gets interesting is that what I think you're talking about, which is the extent to which one should turn a blind eye to those questions, in order to deny a foothold to the right wing who want to deny any form of climate change policy. And on that, I can understand what you're saying. I'm not actually sure, because I don't think a simplistic answer is the right solution to a simplistic challenge. But having said that, things can get very nasty. I think the academic answer to your question, though, is what people like Martin Heyer have called a discourse coalition, or what he calls, in a very academic way, an epiphenomenal, which is basically you get different political actors arguing about different things. So like laws against smoking 20 years ago, fox hunting 30 years ago, now it's net zero. It's the same debate, but using different items. And we need to be careful about reducing those complex debates to yes-no answers about those particular things.
Thank you.
Just one question about Graham's work. So, forgive me if you can't answer it, but maybe you could pivot it to your own thinking. When he was at UCL, there's some wonderful courses for students on foraging, local foraging, and kind of environmental sociology plus citizen science, and students would go to the parks and end up collecting nettles and other edible things. They never knew they were walking right past. And so I wondered to what extent you think he was thinking about localism a lot in environmental movements. Obviously, a lot about the global picture. And we know he had a farm, of course. So what extent do you think he felt this had to start very locally, even with his own practice, before had a global vision, or not? And if I say you can't answer that, what's your particular view on that?
Thank you. So the question was about localism as a basis for this. Yeah. I've never talked to Graham. I met Graham several times, but we never actually had a discussion like that as such. But I could infer that he was somebody who, as Gandhi said it, here I'm talking about Gandhi, be the change you want to be. And he was, interpersonally, and also in his life, being the farmer and the forager and the forester. And in that, if that is called localism, then I think that is a good way to make it happen. Although I think there's a problem when one talks about localism, that we're talking about unmanageable individualism. I mean, an individualist in the neoliberal sense is also a local. So I think there's this idea of global norms. He was buying into global norms, but implementing them himself, which I think is what I would agree with as well. At least I would hope to do.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. Going back to that diagram, the Nash diagram about the value of nature of people at different stages of society development, or whatever we call it. Basically, it can place the idea of time and the idea of some kind of level of development. So the argument one there is like stuff does deteriorate.
I'm sorry, I really can't hear you.
Does stuff deteriorate in some points? Like, are there cases in which the arrow of time and the arrow of social development isn't the same thing?
Right. My understanding of the Nash diagram is that it is hugely simplistic, but raises interesting questions. His diagram is not really meant to be like a map of what happens to nature as one develops, but rather a map of a sort of stereotypical vision of how people perceive nature as they get more modernized. In other words, is how nature becomes a commodity that people are worried about. So if I'm understanding the Nash diagram correctly, if we lived in a stereotypical world of people living in mud huts, stamping out insects and snakes in order to live, and at the other end, you've got people crammed into 47th Street, with a picture of a tiger on the wall, then I can see what he's talking about. Now, all of that is stereotypical. And you could argue that maybe it doesn't work anymore, given that we have such a globalization of ideas, that even those people in Africa are still like turning on TVs and watching Baywatch or something, I don't know. So the diagram is meant to be a proposition about how nature and time and development are linked. I tend to think it's generally accurate.
So to clarify on top of that, where I was trying to get with the question. The idea is that you start with, there's that conflation of time and development.
Yeah.
Do we see cases of where social development has gone backward in a way, simplifying? Do we see that phenomenon of people suddenly like perceiving interest something less external, or the perceiving value of nature as something suddenly less valuable? And is that perhaps connected to the idea of this backlash that we're actually seeing against the idea of whatever it might be, net zero climate policy? Is the fact that people are doing worse in terms of their quality of life, perhaps, or in terms of what they perceive to be the level of civilizedness, the reason why people might be perceiving nature as something less valuable?
I'm with you. I can see what you're saying, and that's an excellent suggestion. I mean, I think the idea is that does it always imply that as time goes by, the more developed we do, and the more reified nature becomes? No, I don't think even Nash would say that. I think the idea is that it probably gets more diversified. I mean, one thing which annoys me, I mean, I was involved in various assessments in the UK and outside, is how far ideas of net zero seem to be represented as government policy and regulation of business under the bracket of like taxes, as opposed to nature becoming Attenborough-ized. It's another verb I've invented, which is that basically if a politician wants to talk to the British person about nature, they have to go down the road of saying, well, what do they watch on a Sunday night? Which is normally like pictures of seals somewhere. You know, I'm being stereotypical. But the idea of connecting the two seems to be a bit broken apart for me. That's the thing that worries me slightly. I mean, under the Boris Johnson years in particular, there was a tendency for Johnson, Zach Goldsmith, the environment minister, and so everyone said the wife of Boris Johnson would tend to talk largely about animal-based nature conservation, as opposed to like energy, access to water, and other stuff like that, access to technologies. So yes, it bifurcates, it diversifies. Absolutely. Hello.
Thank you so much for the talk. I'm curious whether you would say there are any lessons or best practices that perhaps IPBES can emulate from the IPCC. I'm not saying that IPCC is like better, but like it appears between the two. Of course, they have similarities in terms of just creating the assessments. IPCC will have perhaps a bigger impact in terms of like policy and things like mainstream conversation.
Very good question. Thank you. Well, the IPCC has been able to put itself into a position as the arbiter for what is happening in climate change. That probably is an example of best practice that IPBES hasn't yet achieved. However, it's complicated because I would stick my neck out and say that both organizations have got significant flaws. Okay. But also, secondly, there are huge overlaps. So in the 1990s, there's a Brit called Bob Watson who's in charge of the IPCC. He's now very high up in IPBES. And many of the principles he wanted to do in IPCC 25 years ago are being replicated. And one of those things is this idea of talking with one voice. And the idea of talking with one voice is that you get a room full of 400 scientists and they have to hammer out a statement that they're all happy to sign up to. And that means they can go to the outside world and say, we are 100% behind this. 400 scientists have said this, right? And usually it's not a happy way to go. It's too simple. It's too crude. It hides important questions which needed to be discussed earlier. There are various clumsy ways of communicating which the IPCC does. I think the crucial point about the IPCC is, for right or for wrong, it's divided itself into the science, working group one, the science, atmospheric modelers, and then the rest of the group are subservient to working group one. So the atmospheric modelers say the atmosphere is getting more greenhouse gases, and then the rest of the group has to say, well, what are we going to do about those gases? And I think that's still getting in the way of progress. Too much of the IPCC working group 2 is basically saying, we must respond to those gases, rather than saying things like, we must reduce vulnerability generally in order to cope better with the gases.
of his end scale was the continent of Africa. And I feel like this is a common racist problem in discourse, that we're addressing a continent at the same level as we're addressing a very specific location. And I just wondered if that diagram is then falling into the traps that you're talking about prioritising localism and avoiding universal conversations.
Probably yes to all of that. Yeah, I mean, there's a rhetorical flourish in saying 47th Street to try and, but at the same time, I don't want to say Tanzania, for example, because that might target Tanzania too much. So yeah, sure. One has to be careful about how one talks about things. But certainly I've spent a lot of time in local places, in Asia at least. The diagram, well, it's 50 years old now? It's older than the dark side of the moon. I mean, it's a simple diagram. I'm not selling it. I'm using it as a point of discussion.
Thank you. And then the final question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really interesting lecture. I was talking to a friend who teaches in primary schools and learning outside the classroom. And she's been interviewing teachers about trying to get children to grow more food. One of the things that she pointed out is that education at that level, and I would argue up to university level, has become increasingly reductionist, and so this idea of human ecology, which and systems thinking, and the interconnectedness of everything, which I would say is a real strength of anthropology. Do you think? I mean, what do you think of that? Is this something that really needs to be brought to the fore in talking about discriminative change?
The thing brought to the fore is what, the reductionist? No, sorry. The what? The complexity? Oh, yeah.
I mean, a discipline which was used to be human ecology, which, it's...
Well, the short answer is yes, definitely. My point of view, as somebody who isn't, who used to do some physical science but isn't now, is that there are epistemological hazards of talking about systems thinking, because you tend to organize people and inputs according to systems. If you look at the diagrams that Bob Watson used to do in the 1990s, he draws climate change as a system, input of the gases, output of the impacts, therefore everything's run by the gases. Take the gases away, everything else gets sorted. I think the world's more complex now. Okay, so yes, definitely everything is interconnected, but I think we have to be cautious of the way in which we talk about systems in case we are hiding values or imposing values. That's simply it, but there's so many more ways to do it than what I've talked about today.
Do you think the transformative change assessment is fit and proper?
It certainly isn't fit enough for the purpose they say it is. I don't want to be a destroyer. I mean, there are plenty of people in the world who should read this report and will learn from it, okay? But I think it's a missed opportunity to say what really needs to happen. I think we're going to be stuck in the same way as we were stuck after the Millennium Assessment, which is basically to say we must fix the physical system rather than understanding what's driving the actual changes. I think it's too shallow when it comes to social and political and economic change.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Steve.